Every year, Beijing sets ambitious growth targets for each of China's provinces. And during China's boom years, local governments didn't have much trouble meeting these targets. But recently, as domestic demand has slowed, they've resorted to borrowing unsustainable amounts of money to fund lavish but fundamentally unaffordable infrastructure projects. Now, these projects do inflate local GDP to help them achieve the targets, but they also create unsustainable debt burdens. And in the past few years, at least one province has admitted that they can no longer afford to pay its debts, with more expected to follow later this year. So in this video, we're going to take a look at China's brewing local government debt crisis, why infrastructure isn't always a good investment, and why, even if it doesn't cause a full-on financial disaster, this is still a serious problem for the CCP. So, to understand this story, you need to know a bit about how GDP works in China. For most of the world, GDP growth is measured as an output by statistical authorities at the end of the year, and it just records the change in economic activity from the previous year. In China, though, instead of just measuring it at the end of the year, the central government actively sets GDP targets for regional governments at the beginning of the year. Now, usually the CCP sets pretty high targets, both to keep unemployment low and to impress international markets. However, this makes life pretty tough for local governments, because even though they've been responsible for funding their own public services and meeting Beijing's growth targets since 1994, most tax money goes directly to Beijing. This means that local governments in China are drastically underfunded, and to make matters worse, they're limited in how much money they can actually borrow. So if local governments aren't allowed to borrow money, or even keep their own taxes, how do they meet these growth targets? Well, sometimes they just lie about it. A 2019 study found that officials from across the country have been overestimating GDP and lying about capital investment numbers. And the CCP even arrested officials in Liaoning, Inner Mongolia, and Tianjin for overstating local GDP. However, this kind of flat-out lying is rare, and the way that local governments usually get around this is by using shell companies, known as local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. The way this works is that local governments give these LGFVs land for free, and the LGFVs then either sell the land to developers, or more often use the land as collateral to borrow money. These LGFVs then invest that money into expensive infrastructure projects. Now, that's down to the fact that infrastructure counts as investment, and investment is a component of GDP. So more infrastructure means higher GDP. However, not all infrastructure projects are actually good investments. And that might sound a bit weird if you're from the West, because, well, basically every Western country is desperately in need of better infrastructure. So we struggle to imagine a world where more infrastructure is a bad idea. Just try and get a train from Manchester to Leeds or Washington DC to Pittsburgh, and you'll quickly realize that the Western world desperately needs to invest in its infrastructure. However, China has almost the opposite problem. Its infrastructure is almost too good, at least relative to the demands of their relatively poor population, which means that new infrastructure projects are basically unnecessary. In economic terms, these new investments don't actually increase productivity, or at least don't sufficiently increase productivity to justify their upfront costs. To illustrate this, imagine London, but without any bridges. The first few bridges built would be a great investment. Even if the government borrowed the money to build them, they would still end up paying for themselves because it would mean more economic activity and ultimately more taxes. Subsequent bridges would continue to be effective in reducing traffic, but at diminishing returns. And it would eventually reach the point where another multi-million-pound bridge just wouldn't contribute enough to the economy to justify its construction. And that's almost exactly what's happened in the Chinese province of Guizhou, for example. Guizhou is a picturesque mountainous province in the southwest of China. It's one of the poorest provinces in the country, with a mostly agricultural economy and GDP per capita of less than $7,000. But its GDP has been growing rapidly over the past few years. However, this growth has been driven not by household consumption, but by infrastructure investment, especially in bridges. In the last 15 years or so, Guizhou's local government has built over 1,000 new bridges, including some of the highest bridges in the world. This bridge, for example, cost over 1 billion yuan and sits nearly 2,000 feet above the river below. However, despite being very impressive, these bridges haven't made much of a difference to the productivity of the region or the tax revenues of it, which is why, earlier this month, the region's central government admitted that it had taken on too much debt and needed help from the Chinese central government. While this is clearly one of the worst affected provinces, this is happening all across China, which is why local government debt has expanded so rapidly in recent years. IMF data shows that China's explicit local government debt has nearly doubled in just 5 years to over 35 trillion yuan, or roughly $5 trillion. But this doesn't even include the LGFVs, which account for a further $10 trillion or so. And this problem is set to become particularly acute later this year, as a disproportionate fraction of these local government bonds come due. This whole problem has been exacerbated by China's property crisis, though, and the impacts that this has on land values, because local governments use their land sales to fund and collateralize their spending. You get the idea then. China's local governments have taken on unsustainable debt in order to fund infrastructure projects to meet Beijing's GDP targets. And the problem is only going to get more acute later in the year. So, does that mean that China's economy is about to collapse, as many YouTube videos apparently suggest? Well, the short answer is no. Even if local governments can't pay their debts, China probably won't suffer a spectacular debt crisis anytime soon, because the country's central government has such a firm grip on China's financial sector that it can, for the most part, rearrange balance sheets in order to avoid a catastrophe. However, this debt can still be bad for the economy even if it doesn't result in a debt crisis per se, because enormous debt burdens like those experienced by China's local governments can act as a massive drag on the economy by reducing fiscal space and creating loads of uncertainty. Now, China is obviously hoping that they can fix this issue and clear up any market uncertainty. But we'll have to wait and see whether they can do this, or if it becomes a wider issue. No matter which outcome you'd prefer, though, every person and news source has a bias. And no matter how hard each of us try, we'll inevitably miss some stories, or worse, only get half the story. In fact, blind spots are everywhere. Ground News is a website and app that collects thousands of articles to help you better understand the world around you. For every story, you can see which news outlets have reported on it and where these outlets fall on the political spectrum. You can even compare headlines, as well as reading the full story without ever leaving the app. But my favorite part of the app and website is the aptly named blind spot feed. Here you can see specific stories which have received excessive, lopsided coverage. For example, check out this news story about the money raised following Ron DeSantis' presidential launch campaign. It only has 20% left-leaning coverage, meaning that if you only read left-leaning news outlets, there's a good chance you missed this story. That's because Ground News offers a comprehensive breakdown for every story. You can read every headline, view the political bias and factuality score for every source, and you can even read the articles themselves right there in the app. And when it comes to blind spots, it's not just about discovering different stories. It's also about discovering just how political biases frame the stories themselves. Because of all of this, I have Ground on my phone's home screen, and I honestly can't recommend them enough. So, to help you get on board, we've decided to offer a special 30% discount on Ground News' Vantage subscription. And you can only access this discount by clicking the link down below. So, check it out, click the link, and help support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.